For 15 years of military service, I sent home every paycheck. When I came home wounded at Christmas dinner, Dad said, "You are a burden, get out of my house." I took a bus to my grandfather's farm. The moment he saw me, he revealed a truth about the money I had sent home, and it left me completely shattered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia. I am 33 years old, and until recently, I was a logistics and intelligence officer in the United States Army. I grew up in a sprawling, pristine house in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. From the outside, the Caldwell family was the absolute picture of Black excellence. My father, Reginald, is an elder at our prominent local church and a proud member of several elite gentlemen's clubs. My mother, Vivian, is a former Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority sister who breathes social status and perfectly catered garden parties. And then there is Dominique, my younger sister. She was the golden child. She graduated top of her class from Spelman College, became a dermatologist, and married a wealthy white finance broker named Preston. In my parents' eyes, she was the ultimate trophy. I was the exact opposite. I did not care about cotillions or country club memberships. I joined the military right out of high school because I wanted to build my own path, but I still loved my family deeply. Or at least, the idea of them. Over 15 years, I survived harsh deployments and grueling logistics missions. I lived incredibly modestly, sending 80% of my combat pay and bonuses straight back to my parents. They told me they were managing a family trust for me, building a solid financial foundation for when I finally returned to civilian life. I trusted them completely. That trust evaporated the night I finally came home. 2 months prior, my unit was caught in a devastating blast. I survived, but I lost my right leg below the knee. After weeks of intense physical rehabilitation, I was honorably discharged and fitted with a state-of-the-art carbon fiber prosthetic. All I wanted was to spend Christmas with my family, to feel the warmth of my childhood home, smell my mother's famous sweet potato pie, and be surrounded by the people I had been faithfully supporting for over a decade. I did not tell them exactly when I was arriving because I wanted it to be a surprise. I took a cab straight from the airport on Christmas Eve. The house was blazing with holiday lights, expensive designer wreaths hanging from every window. I could hear the faint sound of jazz music and laughter spilling out into the cold winter air. I adjusted my grip on my forearm crutches, took a deep breath, and pushed the heavy oak front door open. The living room was a scene of absolute luxury. Crystal glasses clinked, a massive, perfectly decorated tree dominated the corner. My parents, Dominique and her husband Preston, were gathered around the fireplace dressed in immaculate holiday wear. The laughter stopped the exact second they saw me. There were no gasps of joy. No one rushed forward to embrace me. No one even asked if I was in pain. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I stood in the doorway, my carbon fiber leg clearly visible beneath my tailored slacks. My father, Reginald, slowly set his crystal wine glass down on the mahogany coffee table. The sharp clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. He did not look at my face. He stared directly at my prosthetic leg with an expression of pure disgust. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and tossed it onto the table. It was a copy of my military discharge notice, which had been mailed to my home address. "Is this your grand entrance, Nia?" My father asked, his voice dripping with venom. "You come limping in here to play the victim." I froze, my mind struggling to process his words. "Dad, I just got back. I was injured. I thought you would be happy I am alive." He scoffed, adjusting his expensive Rolex. "Happy. This family spends every waking moment building a reputation of excellence in Atlanta. We are leaders in this community. Dominique is a respected doctor. Preston is managing millions in crypto assets. And what do you bring to our table? A severed leg and a sob story." I looked at my mother, Vivian, hoping for a shred of maternal instinct. She just looked away, smoothing down her immaculate silk dress, entirely embarrassed by my very presence. "You are making a mess of the foyer with those wet crutches," she muttered, not even meeting my eyes. My father stepped closer, his imposing figure looming over me. He pointed a finger toward the front door. "You are not going to drag our family name down with your pity party. We are hosting the mayor and several hospital board members for dinner tomorrow. I will not have them looking at you and asking uncomfortable questions. You are a burden, Nia. Pack whatever junk you brought and get out of my house. I will not feed a crippled freeloader." The sheer cruelty of his words hit me like physical blows. I had sacrificed my youth, my body, and my finances to support the very foundation of their lavish lifestyle. I had sent them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. I gripped my crutches tighter, feeling the cold metal press deeply into my palms. I planted my prosthetic firmly on the hardwood floor, squaring my shoulders and drawing on every ounce of military discipline I possessed to keep my voice steady. A burden, I repeated quietly. "Dad, I have funded this family for 15 years. Every month I sent you my blood money. Where is my trust fund? I am not leaving until I get what is mine." Before my father could respond, a heavy, pale hand clapped down hard on my shoulder from behind. The heavy, pale hand squeezed my shoulder with an unbearable, patronizing weight. I did not have to turn around to know who it belonged to. The sickeningly sweet smell of rum and nutmeg hit my nose before Preston even opened his mouth. He stepped around me, swirling a crystal glass of eggnog, his custom-tailored velvet jacket catching the light of the massive Christmas tree. Preston was my sister Dominique's husband. He was a white finance broker who specialized in cryptocurrency, and he loved nothing more than coming to our family gatherings to flex his privilege and educate us on how the real world worked. He gave me a tight, arrogant smirk, the kind reserved for people he considered charity cases. "Come on, Reginald. Let us not be too harsh," Preston said, though his eyes danced with amusement. "Nia just does not understand how the modern economy functions outside of a military barracks." He took a slow sip of his drink and looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my carbon fiber prosthetic with blatant disrespect. "Listen to me," Nia, Preston continued, using that slow, measured tone people use when explaining things to a child. "Did the Army completely fail to teach you basic financial literacy? You cannot just show up here expecting a free ride because you went overseas and got yourself hurt. If you had listened to me a few years ago and put your meager military salary into the crypto funds I manage for Dominique, you would not be standing here begging for scraps. As a white man navigating high-level finance, I see this all the time. People refusing to adapt. I highly suggest you learn your place and know your limits. You need to understand that this family values actual success, not liabilities." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the warm, cinnamon-scented air of the living room. He stood there, a man who had never faced a day of real hardship in his life, lecturing a combat veteran about hard work in her own childhood home. My father stood silently by, allowing this outsider to disrespect his own daughter, because Preston represented the wealthy image my father so desperately craved. Dominique sat on the velvet sofa, crossing her legs and smiling proudly at her husband's condescending speech. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply raised my hand and shoved his arm off my shoulder with enough military-trained force to make him stumble backward. The sudden movement caught him completely off guard. His arm jerked and the thick eggnog sloshed violently over the rim of his crystal glass, splashing directly onto his expensive velvet lapel and his perfectly manicured fingers. "Hey, what is your problem?" Preston snapped, his face flushing red as he frantically wiped at the sticky stain on his jacket. "My problem?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy calm that made the entire room freeze. I leaned my weight onto my crutches and locked eyes with him. "My problem is that a parasite is standing in a house I funded, calling me a freeloader." Preston scoffed, looking at my father for backup. "A house you funded? You are delusional. You are a disabled dropout asking for a handout." I ignored his insult and turned my gaze directly to my father. Reginald Caldwell suddenly looked very rigid. The booming authority he had used to throw my discharge papers on the table just moments ago began to evaporate. Let us talk about financial literacy, Preston, I said, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the lavish room. Let us talk about the 15 years I spent sleeping on military cots, eating rationed meals, and dodging shrapnel in the desert. For 180 straight months, I took exactly 20% of my combat pay to survive. Every single remaining dollar, 80% of my blood, sweat, and hazard pay, was directly deposited into the Caldwell Family Trust. I took a heavy step forward. The mechanical hum of my prosthetic joint sounded unnaturally loud in the dead silent room. Dominique shifted uncomfortably on the velvet sofa, her proud smile instantly vanishing as her eyes darted nervously between her husband and our parents. My parents told me they were investing it. I continued, my voice sharp and unwavering. They told me they were building a solid financial foundation so that when I finally returned to civilian life, whether whole or in pieces, I would be secure. That was over $450,000 in cash. $450,000 of my money. I turned back to Preston. He had stopped wiping his jacket and was now staring at me with a blank, confused expression. The arrogant finance broker suddenly looked like a deer caught in the headlights. So before you stand there with your crypto brochures and your unearned confidence mansplaining wealth and hard work to me, I want you to tell me something, Preston. Where is my money? Where is the nearly $500,000 I sent to this family? Preston blinked, looking utterly lost. He turned to my father, his posture deflating entirely. Reginald. What is she talking about? What trust fund? My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. The great church elder, the proud patriarch of the Caldwell family, suddenly looked like a cornered animal. The heavy gold watch on his wrist seemed to weigh his arm down. He cleared his throat, trying to summon a commanding tone to regain control of his living room. Nia, this is a private family matter. We are not discussing this right now. You are making a scene. We are discussing it right now, I demanded, stepping past Preston and moving closer to the center of the room. I want to see the bank statements. I want to see the trust portfolio. You called me an unemployed burden. I want to see exactly how my money was managed. I did not wait for my father to formulate another lie. I knew exactly who ran the finances in this house. I slowly turned my head, my gaze slicing through the heavy tension until it landed squarely on the armchair by the fireplace. My mother Vivian was sitting there. She was perfectly still. Her posture was completely rigid, and her knuckles were white where she gripped the leather armrests. The polite high society smile she always wore for her sorority sisters had completely vanished. In its place was a cold, hard mask of absolute panic staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. That panic vanished as quickly as it appeared. My mother is a master of Southern social warfare, a woman who can carve out your heart while offering you a slice of pound cake. Vivian took a slow, deliberate breath. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached up to trace the smooth curve of her signature pearl necklace. The soft clack of the pearls sounded like a ticking clock in the dead silence of the room. She stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her flawless silk dress, and looked at me not as a daughter who had just survived a war zone, but as a stain on her pristine rug. "Are you actually standing in my foyer calculating pennies against your own flesh and blood?" Vivian asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of any maternal warmth. "You march in here unannounced, tracking mud onto my floors, and have the nerve to interrogate us about family finances." I did not flinch. I did not lower my voice. "Where is my money, Mom?" Vivian lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "I reallocated those funds, Nia. Preston needed capital to secure the commercial lease for your sister's new dermatology clinic in Buckhead. He invested your contributions into a high-yield portfolio to ensure Dominique had the state-of-the-art facility she deserves." The room spun. I looked at Preston, who suddenly puffed out his chest, his earlier confusion replaced by a smug, entitled grin now that my mother had validated his theft. He had not just lost his own money. He had gambled mine. "You gave my life savings to him." I asked, the sheer absurdity of the betrayal making my chest ache. "I sent that money home so I would have a foundation when I got out. I trusted you." "You did what was expected of you," Vivian snapped back, stepping closer. Her voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. Do not stand there and act like a martyr. Dominique is a Spelman graduate. She is a board-certified doctor. She is the face of the Caldwell legacy in Atlanta. She attends the galas, she hosts the charity events, and she upholds the standard we worked our entire lives to build. What exactly are you, Nia? You are a college dropout who ran away to play soldier in the dirt. You abandoned the path we laid out for you. Sending a portion of your paycheck home was the absolute bare minimum you could do to compensate for the continuous embarrassment you caused this family. It was your obligation. I turned my gaze to Dominique. My little sister, the one I had protected from neighborhood bullies, the one whose first car I had helped pay for before I even enlisted. She sat comfortably on the plush velvet sofa, swirling the remnants of her expensive champagne. She did not look guilty. She did not look remorseful. Instead, she crossed her legs, letting her designer heel dangle effortlessly, and gave me a slow, triumphant smirk. "Mom is right, Nia." Dominique chimed in, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness she used for her wealthy clients. "We put that money to much better use than you ever could have. You should be proud. Your little military checks helped build a real empire." "A real empire," I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are building a fake empire on stolen money. You are all thieves dressed in designer clothes." That was the breaking point. The word thief echoed in the pristine living room, shattering the illusion of their perfect high society life. Reginald's face contorted with absolute fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He could not tolerate insubordination, and he certainly could not tolerate being called out in his own home. He lunged forward. He did not care that I had just returned from a war zone. He did not care that I was missing a portion of my leg. He closed the distance between us in two massive strides and grabbed the thick lapels of my winter coat. His large hands twisted the fabric, jerking me forward with terrifying force. My crutches slipped on the polished hardwood, clattering loudly against the floor as I struggled to maintain my balance on my single good leg and the carbon fiber prosthetic. "You disrespectful, ungrateful wretch!" Reginald roared, his saliva hitting my cheek. "You will not stand in my house and insult my family. You are a disgrace to the Caldwell name." He dragged me backward. The rubber tip of my prosthetic squeaked violently against the floorboards. I tried to brace myself, but he was too strong, driven by the frantic need to remove the ugly truth I represented from his beautiful home. He shoved me toward the entryway, ripping the heavy oak front door wide open. The freezing December wind howled into the foyer, biting instantly at my exposed skin. "Dad, stop!" I shouted, fighting to keep myself upright as he pushed me over the threshold. "You are nothing but a burden!" Reginald screamed over the howling wind. He shoved me one final time, sending me stumbling out onto the icy concrete of the front porch. I hit the frozen ground hard, the impact jarring my spine and sending a sharp, blinding spike of pain straight through my severed nerve endings. "Get out!" he snarled, glaring down at me as I lay shivering in the snow. "And do not ever come back. This house does not shelter burdens." He slammed the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt echoed through the freezing night, locking me out in the cold. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a finality that shook the frames of the expensive paintings in the foyer, leaving me standing on the porch in the biting December wind. My father's words were a cold anchor in my chest. I did not cry. My tear ducts had been cauterized by years of watching friends lose limbs and lives in places where loyalty was actually earned, not just demanded. I adjusted my coat, the fabric stiff against the sub-zero air, and began the slow, uneven march toward the driveway. Each step on the carbon fiber prosthetic felt like a lesson in defiance. I didn't stumble. I didn't look back at the warm, golden glow of the home I had paid for with my youth. I hauled myself onto the midnight bus, the heater rattling and coughing out a weak metallic heat that did nothing to warm the chill of the homecoming. The ride to the outskirts of the county felt like a transition between two worlds. The pristine, manicured suburbs of my parents' neighborhood slowly gave way to the rougher, darker landscape of the county roads. By the time I disembarked, the snow was falling in heavy, thick clumps, coating the world in a deceptive, quiet purity. My grandfather Ezekiel's farm was an anomaly in the region. While the surrounding land had been swallowed up by commercial developers and modern tract housing, his property remained a stubborn, rugged patch of earth. The fences were weathered, the barns sagging, and the main farmhouse was a relic of a time when hard work meant more than just a social media aesthetic. I navigated the long gravel driveway on my crutches, the rhythmic thud-clack of my prosthetic punctuating the absolute silence of the woods. When I reached the porch, I didn't need to knock. The front door groaned open before I could even raise my hand. Grandfather Ezekiel stood there, his silhouette framed by the amber light of the kitchen. He was 80 years old, his skin like cured leather, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask about the war. He simply stepped aside and held the door open, the smell of wood smoke and slow-cooked meat flooding out to meet me. I walked into the kitchen, the warmth hitting me like a physical weight. My crutches found a resting place against the rough-hewn table, and I collapsed onto a wooden chair. My grandfather didn't ask why I was here, or why I was bleeding from the minor scrapes on my face where my father had pushed me. He knew. He had always known about the Caldwells. He walked to the stove, pulled a plate of thick, hickory-smoked ribs from the warming tray and placed them in front of me. He didn't speak a word until I had taken the first bite. "Eat," he commanded, his voice a gravelly rumble. "You've been eating army cardboard long enough." I ate with a desperation that surprised me, the smoky flavor grounding me. Ezekiel watched me from across the table, his arms folded over his chest. Once the plate was empty, he reached under the table and pulled out a manila envelope. It was frayed at the edges, stained with what looked like coffee and years of dampness. He slid it across the wood, his calloused fingertips resting on the paper for a moment before he let go. "I watched the family trust you were sending money to," he said, his tone devoid of judgment, but heavy with consequence. "I didn't lose track of your earnings, Nia. I kept my own books. Reginald thinks he's the only one who knows how to move numbers around. He thinks because he's an elder at that church he can wash his hands of the truth." I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of deposit slips and bank statements, the ones my parents claimed were being funneled into my secure trust. But as I flipped through them, the reality shifted. They weren't trust fund allocations. They were withdrawal slips. Every single month, the moment the funds from my deployment pay hit the account, they were transferred out. I stared at the paper, my breath catching. Where did it go? Grandfather? Where is the $500,000? Ezekiel leaned back, his chair creaking. "That's the thing, child. Your father didn't give that money to your sister's medical clinic. He didn't put it in stocks. He didn't buy a single investment in your name. Reginald had a problem. A gambling problem that started right around the time you finished your first tour. He was losing money at the underground poker tables in the city. He didn't just spend your money. He used your hard-earned paychecks to cover his own debts. And that husband of your sister's, that white boy Preston, he didn't invest in a clinic. He bought into a pyramid scheme that wiped out the last of your father's leverage. They didn't just spend your money, Nia. They are broke, and they are desperate." I looked at the documents again, the reality of the betrayal finally settling into my bones, colder than the Georgia winter. They hadn't just been greedy, they had been pathetic. My father, the leader of the church, the man who demanded perfection and status, had built his entire identity on the back of my survival, only to lose it all at a card table. I looked up at Ezekiel, my eyes burning. "What do we do?" Ezekiel smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Reginald thinks he threw you out into the snow, Nia. He thinks he discarded a liability. He has no idea he just handed you the key to his entire world. Because while your father was busy losing your money at the poker table, I was busy buying up the debt he didn't know he had. That farmhouse, that mansion in the suburbs, they don't belong to the bank anymore. They belong to a shell company I established 3 years ago. And that shell company is owned by the soldier he just kicked into the cold. You aren't a burden, Nia. You are the one holding the mortgage on his life." I pulled the stack of papers closer, the harsh overhead light of the kitchen casting long shadows across the black and white ink. My military training had taught me how to read after-action reports, how to scan for casualties and critical failures in the field. The papers spread out before me were exactly that. An after-action report of a financial massacre. I flipped past the initial withdrawal slips my father had authorized and dug into the secondary documents Ezekiel had managed to secure. There were bank statements from an offshore account, trading logs, and margin call notices. The name at the top of these catastrophic ledgers was not Dominique Caldwell. It was Preston Hayes. I traced the columns with my index finger, deciphering the financial jargon. Preston had not secured a commercial lease in Buckhead for my sister's dermatology clinic. There was no high-yield portfolio. There was no real estate investment. Preston, the arrogant broker who had just lectured me on the modern economy while sipping my family's eggnog, was a complete fraud. He had poured every single dollar of my combat pay into highly volatile derivative stocks. He had engaged in aggressive margin trading, betting money he did not have on futures that never materialized. He was not a financial genius. He was a degenerate gambler hiding behind a velvet jacket and a finance degree. The logs showed a rapid, brutal descent. Within 18 months of my first deployment, Preston had completely wiped out my savings. But the bleeding did not stop there. The documents revealed that his reckless trading had triggered massive margin calls. He owed millions. The brokerage firm he worked for had discovered his unauthorized trades. He was not just facing bankruptcy, he was staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud and embezzlement charges. I looked up at my grandfather, the smoked ribs turning to ash in my mouth. Preston was going to go to prison. I stated the reality of the situation, sharpening my voice. Ezekiel nodded slowly, his weathered hands resting flat on the wooden table. Federal prison. A white-collar resort maybe, but a cell nonetheless. And your father could not stomach the scandal. I looked back down at the documents, my eyes catching on a separate bundle of papers bound by a heavy metal clip. I pulled them free and began to read. These were not trading logs. They were property deeds, loan agreements, and notarized mortgage contracts. The name on the property deed was Ezekiel Caldwell. My stomach plummeted. I read the legal descriptions, the parcel numbers, the boundary coordinates. They all described the very ground I was sitting on, the farm that had been in our family for 3 generations, the land my grandfather had worked with his bare hands long before Reginald ever bought his first tailored suit. I sifted through the attached loan documents. Reginald Caldwell's signature was slashed across the bottom line as a guarantor, accompanied by a power of attorney, claiming he had the legal right to leverage his father's assets. My father had taken out a massive commercial mortgage against Grandpa Ezekiel's farm. The timeline perfectly aligned with Preston's margin calls. Reginald had not just covered up for his golden son-in-law. He had stolen the ancestral farm to do it. To keep Preston out of a federal penitentiary and preserve the pristine, flawless image of the Caldwell family in Atlanta. High society, my father had secretly liquidated Ezekiel's legacy. He had handed over the farm to the bank to pay off Preston's toxic debt and buy his silence. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal made the kitchen walls feel like they were closing in. My father had thrown me out into the snow for asking about my own money, all while he had committed a far worse crime against his own father. Reginald had sacrificed my blood money and Ezekiel's sweat to save a con artist who looked good in family photos. My vision blurred with a sudden, intense rage. The phantom pain in my missing leg flared, a sharp, burning reminder of exactly what I had traded for those checks. I had dodged shrapnel, slept in the dirt, and left a piece of my body in a foreign desert to build a future. My father had taken that future and burned it to keep a liar warm. I gripped the edges of the mortgage agreement, the paper crinkling under the force of my clenched fists. My knuckles turned white. The mechanical hum of my prosthetic joint clicked softly as I shifted my weight, leaning over the table. So, he used the farm to bail out Preston. I said, my voice eerily calm, suppressing the violent storm brewing inside my chest. I looked at the old man sitting across from me, the man who had worked this land since he was a boy. So you lost this farm? Grandfather Ezekiel did not flinch. He did not look like a man who had just been robbed of his life's work. Instead, he reached out, tapped the very last page of the file, and offered a slow, impossibly cold smile. He slowly flipped to the final page of the thick stack of documents. The harsh fluorescent light above the kitchen island illuminated a crisp, notarized certificate bearing the seal of the state of Georgia. The logo at the top read Vanguard Asset Management, a corporate entity I had never heard of. "Reginald thinks he outsmarted me," Ezekiel began, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that commanded absolute attention. "He thought because I wear denim and work the soil, I cannot read a balance sheet. 2 years ago, he forged my signature on a secondary power of attorney. He used it to leverage this farm, tying it directly to the mortgage of his precious Buckhead estate to secure a massive line of credit. He needed fast cash to cover his underground gambling markers and to bail Preston out of a margin call that would have sent that boy straight to federal prison." I stared at the paperwork, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of my father's actions. "He risked your home," I asked, the betrayal twisting like a knife in my gut. "He put the family farm on the line to save a con artist." "He did," Ezekiel confirmed, his eyes hardening. "And when the loans defaulted 6 months later because Preston is a fool who throws good money after bad, the bank moved to foreclose on everything. They were going to take the farm. They were going to take the Buckhead mansion. They were going to seize the commercial lease for Dominique's fancy new clinic. Your father was facing complete financial ruin and public humiliation. The church would have stripped him of his title. His country club friends would have laughed him out of the city." Ezekiel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "But Reginald is a coward. Instead of facing the music, he begged the bank for an extension, claiming he had a wealthy private investor willing to buy out the toxic debt and assume the mortgages. The bank agreed to sell the debt to a private collection firm for pennies on the dollar just to clear their ledgers." I looked at the certificate again. Vanguard Asset Management. "And this company bought the debt," I asked, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. Ezekiel nodded, pouring us both a glass of dark amber bourbon. Reginald was thrilled. "He thinks Vanguard is some faceless Wall Street conglomerate that he can charm and delay with partial payments and empty promises. He thinks he bought himself time to maintain his illusion of wealth. He has been throwing lavish Christmas parties, buying your mother pearls, and pretending everything is fine, while making minimum interest payments to a corporate ghost." Ezekiel slid the glass of bourbon toward me. "But Reginald does not know who owns Vanguard." He tapped a thick, calloused finger directly onto the signature line of the incorporation documents. I followed his hand, my eyes scanning the dense legal text, until they landed on the primary shareholder and sole proprietor. My breath caught in my throat. Nia Caldwell. I stared at my own name printed in bold black ink. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of air. I blinked, sure that the exhaustion and the cold had finally caused me to hallucinate. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time all night. "That is your money," Naya, Ezekiel said softly. "When I realized your father was skimming your deployment pay, I could not stop the initial bleeding. He had already burned through the first 100,000, but I managed to intercept the rest. I rerouted your direct deposits into a blind trust he could not touch. $350,000 of your blood, sweat, and combat pay." Ezekiel took a slow sip of his bourbon. "When Reginald's debts went to auction, I used your intercepted funds to establish Vanguard Asset Management. I used your money to buy the mortgage on this farm. I used your money to buy the mortgage on his Buckhead mansion. I used your money to buy the commercial lease for your sister's clinic." The phantom pain in my missing leg completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming electric surge of adrenaline. The freezing cold from the snowstorm outside was entirely forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. My father had not thrown me away. He had thrown himself into a cage, locked the door, and handed me the key. "Reginald thinks he is a king," Ezekiel continued, his eyes gleaming with a predatory pride. "But he is nothing but a tenant. He lives in a house you own. He sleeps under a roof you bought. He brags about a clinic that operates on your property. Every single piece of the Caldwell empire, the reputation they covet, the wealth they flaunt, the social standing they use. To look down on you belongs entirely to you. I looked down at the documents. The deed to the mansion where I had just been assaulted. The commercial lease for the sister who had just mocked my financial literacy. The farm where my grandfather had spent his entire life. It was all there, bound in a single manila folder, legally transferred, and undeniably mine. They called me a freeloader. I murmured the irony so thick I could practically taste it. They kicked me out into the snow because they thought I was a burden who would ruin their perfect image. Ezekiel chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. They are fools blinded by their own arrogance. Tomorrow morning, Vanguard Asset Management is scheduled to issue a final notice of default. The grace period I instructed the lawyers to provide expires at 9 o'clock. Reginald has missed his last 3 payments because he spent the money on catering and holiday decorations. I picked up the deed to the Buckhead mansion, the heavy paper feeling like a weapon in my hands. The image of my mother smoothing her silk dress, telling me I was a college dropout who ran away to play in the dirt, flashed in my mind. The image of Preston sipping eggnog and lecturing me on the economy burned behind my eyes. The image of my father, his face twisted in rage as he shoved me out the front door, solidified into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I did not have to scream. I did not have to fight for their love or demand their respect. I simply had to enforce the law. "Grandfather," I said, setting the document down and lifting my glass of bourbon. "Call the lawyers. Tell them Vanguard Asset Management is not issuing a warning tomorrow." Ezekiel raised his glass to meet mine, the crystal clinking softly in the warm kitchen. "What are we issuing, Naya?" "We are issuing an immediate notice of eviction," I replied, swallowing the burning liquid. "I want my house back." Ezekiel's smile was not one of joy, but the grim satisfaction of a general recognizing a fellow soldier ready for war. He reached across the table, slid a heavy, outdated laptop toward me, and flipped it open. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue light over the empty rib plates and the scattered financial ruins of the Caldwell family. That night marked the end of my mourning and the beginning of a relentless 6-month tactical strike. I treated Preston's financial history exactly like an enemy insurgent network. My military background was in supply chain intelligence. I spent years in the desert tracking illicit funding through labyrinthine shell corporations and ghost accounts to cut off enemy supply lines. Preston was arrogant, which meant Preston was sloppy. He genuinely believed that running his embezzled funds through basic cryptocurrency tumblers and offshore accounts in the Caymans made him a financial mastermind. To a military intelligence analyst, he had left a highway of digital fingerprints illuminated in neon. "Look at this," I said to Ezekiel one freezing morning in late January. My breath plumed in the cold kitchen air as I pointed to a cascade of encrypted transactions on the monitor. He funneled $80,000 through a fake charity right back into Dominique's personal checking account just 3 days before his massive margin calls hit. They knew the crash was coming. They hoarded cash while letting you take the fall. Ezekiel stood by the wood stove pouring black coffee into a chipped mug. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Can you prove that in a court of law, Nia, I do not need a courtroom?" I replied, hitting the print key on a stack of highly illegal wire transfer records. "I just need leverage, and right now I hold all of it." But simply owning their debt was not a finishing blow. It was just the foundation. I needed to choke their cash flow at the source to ensure they could never buy their way out of this trap. Dominique's entire status, her pristine Buckhead clinic, relied on a constant, uninterrupted supply of high-end, specialized medical equipment. She needed surgical lasers, sterile tools, and expensive dermal injectables to keep her wealthy clients happy and the money flowing. I took Vanguard Asset Management and weaponized it. With Ezekiel's blessing, I liquidated a portion of the farm's unused acreage to a commercial developer. We took that immediate influx of capital and used it to secure wholesale distribution rights for the exact medical suppliers Dominique's clinic depended heavily upon. The sprawling, crumbling barn out back was gutted and retrofitted into a massive climate-controlled warehouse. While my mother hosted high society luncheons and my father preached from the pulpit about the virtues of prosperity, I was hauling 60-pound crates of saline and surgical steel. I worked through the physical agony of my amputation. There were nights when my stump bled inside the carbon fiber socket, the friction tearing my skin raw. I would unstrap the leg, clean the wounds with antiseptic, wrap it in bandages, and go right back to the loading dock. The pain was just fuel. It kept me awake. It kept me angry. The farm completely transformed from a quiet rural retreat into a bustling, ruthless supply chain empire. Delivery trucks rumbled down our gravel driveway at all hours of the night. I built a legitimate, unshakable distribution hub right under their noses. By April, Vanguard Medical Supply had become the exclusive regional distributor for the entire Southeast Corridor. By May, I had legally acquired the regional contracts for every single premium supplier Dominique used. If my sister wanted a single syringe or scalpel in her clinic, she had to buy it from the very sister she had called a dropout. Then we began tightening the noose. Operating as the anonymous head of Vanguard, I raised the commercial lease on her clinic by 40%, a brutal hike that was entirely within the legal rights of the deed I now possessed. When Preston tried to frantically negotiate, I had my lawyers reject their requests for supply credit. I demanded payment in full in cash up front for every single medical delivery. Through my digital tracking, I watched them bleed. I watched my father frantically shuffle funds from his church discretionary accounts just to keep the lights on at his mansion. I watched Preston liquidate his luxury cars. They were drowning, completely unaware that the landlord they were begging for extensions and the medical supplier bankrupting their clinic was sitting in Ezekiel's farmhouse wearing combat boots. It was a suffocatingly humid Tuesday afternoon in June when the trap finally snapped shut. I was standing at the main terminal in the barn reviewing a fresh batch of supply manifests when the perimeter alarm blared. It was a harsh mechanical screech that pierced the quiet country air, echoing off the metal roof of the warehouse. Ezekiel stepped out onto the back porch, a heavy iron wrench gripped loosely in his right hand. His sharp eyes scanned the long, winding dirt road leading up to the property. I wiped axle grease from my hands onto a rag and walked over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. The camera feed displayed a chaotic, desperate scene. Cutting through the thick, wet mud of the farm's long driveway were three immaculate, polished black Mercedes SUVs. They did not belong out here in the dirt, and their drivers clearly did not care. They drove aggressively, their tires spinning wildly, spraying dark, heavy mud across their pristine doors and tinted windows. They slammed to a halt right in the center of the muddy yard, boxing each other in. The doors flew open. The Caldwell family had finally tracked down the phantom owner of Vanguard Asset Management. The driver's side door of the lead SUV swung open, and an immaculate Italian leather loafer stepped directly into a puddle of stagnant rainwater and red clay. Preston Hayes cursed loudly, pulling his foot back as the mud instantly stained the pristine leather. He stepped out more carefully the second time, adjusting the lapels of a light gray summer suit that had absolutely no business being on a working farm. From the second vehicle, Dominique emerged. She was wearing designer sunglasses and holding a silk scarf over her nose and mouth, her face contorted in an expression of profound disgust. Reginald stepped out of the third car. My father looked thinner than I remembered, his posture rigid, the usual arrogant tilt of his chin replaced by a tight, strained grimace of a man backed into a corner. They stood in a cluster in the center of the yard, glaring at the massive, retrofitted barn and the fleet of delivery trucks bearing the subtle Vanguard logo. They had no idea what they were looking at. To them, this was still just Ezekiel's dirt farm, a stain on the Caldwell family legacy. Dominique let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh, her voice cutting through the humid air. "It smells absolutely putrid out here." "Is that cow manure? How can anyone actually breathe this air without contracting a disease?" "I cannot believe we drove 2 hours into the middle of nowhere for this." My father ignored her complaints. His eyes locked onto Ezekiel, who was standing on the edge of the wraparound porch, the heavy iron wrench still resting easily in his grip. I stood half in the shadows of the loading dock, wearing grease-stained coveralls, my carbon fiber leg fully exposed in the summer heat. Reginald marched forward, his ruined shoes squelching in the mud. He did not look at me. I was still invisible to him, a crippled dropout he had discarded 6 months ago. "Put the wrench down, old man," Reginald barked, projecting a false bravado that echoed hollowly across the yard. "We are not here to play country bumpkin games. We are here to do you a massive favor before you lose everything." Ezekiel did not move a single muscle. He just stared down at his son with the cold, detached gaze of a man evaluating a diseased crop. "What kind of favor, Reginald?" Preston stepped up beside my father, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slapped it repeatedly against his palm, adopting that same arrogant, condescending tone he had used on me Christmas Eve. "Let us drop the act," Ezekiel Preston said, flashing a shark-like smile. "We know about the margin calls. We know about the defaulted loans. The bank is preparing to foreclose on this entire property by the end of the week. You are drowning in debt, and quite frankly, you do not have the liquid capital to save this miserable patch of dirt." I leaned against a stack of medical supply crates, watching the performance unfold. It was a master class in projection. Preston was drowning. Preston was facing federal prison. But here he was, trying to bully an old man into giving up his land. I analyzed their appearance, picking up the tactical details they were trying to hide. Dominique was not wearing her diamond tennis bracelet. Reginald's luxury sedan had been replaced by a dealership loaner. Preston's wrist, usually heavy with a solid gold Rolex, was completely bare. They were bleeding out, and this trip was their last desperate tourniquet. My father crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. "Preston has graciously arranged a bailout," he declared as if he were bestowing a blessing. "He has a private equity fund that specializes in distressed agricultural assets. He is willing to assume the toxic debt on this property." Preston took a step closer to the porch, holding the paperwork out. "It is a simple transfer of deed," he explained, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You sign over the rights of the land to my fund. I absorb the bank debt so you do not face public bankruptcy. In exchange, I will authorize a small, immediate cash payout, just enough to get you and your crippled granddaughter into a modest assisted living apartment somewhere far away from here. I will even throw in a few bucks to hire movers so you can clear out your junk by Friday." Dominique lowered her silk scarf just enough to sneer in my direction. "You really should take the deal, Grandpa," she said, her tone sharp and impatient. "Preston is doing you a massive favor. He is already dealing with a nightmare at my clinic because of some faceless corporate monopoly called Vanguard raising my lease and cutting off my medical supplies. We have real high-level business problems to manage. We do not have time to hold your hand while the bank takes your farm. Just sign the paper and take the handout." I felt a dark, cold amusement settle deep in my chest. They were so blinded by their own narcissism that they could not see the executioner standing right in front of them. Preston was trying to steal the farm a second time. He wanted the deed so he could liquidate the land himself, hoping the immediate cash sale would be enough to pay off the Vanguard default notices and keep him out of a federal cell. He was trying to use our property to pay the debt he owed to me. Ezekiel looked at the paperwork in Preston's outstretched hand, then slowly turned his head to look at me. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. It was time to spring it. I stepped out of the shadows of the loading dock. The heavy rhythmic thud of my carbon fiber prosthetic against the concrete ramp echoed loudly in the quiet yard. I walked down the ramp and stepped directly into the mud, my work boots sinking into the red clay, until I was standing face to face with the men who had stolen my life savings. Preston let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Oh good, the war hero is going to weigh in. What are you going to do, Nia? Try to punch me again? Just tell the old man to sign the paper so you both do not end up sleeping on the street." I stopped an arm's length from him. I slowly reached up and gripped the heavy leather work gloves covering my hands. I pulled the right glove off, tossing it into the mud at Preston's feet. Then I pulled the left glove off, letting it drop beside the first. I wiped a streak of grease from my palm onto my coveralls, never breaking eye contact. I looked at the legal document in his hand, then shifted my gaze to lock onto his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "You plan to buy the debt you created using someone else's money, Preston?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, but carrying the force of a detonating shell. Too bad. I am not selling. Preston blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. He looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had just barked out of turn. He let out a patronizing sigh, shaking his head while looking back at my father as if sharing a joke at my expense. "Nia, please," Preston said, turning his attention back to me and adopting the slow, exaggerated cadence one might use to explain long division to a toddler. "I know your time in the infantry did not exactly cover complex corporate acquisitions, so I will make this very simple for you. You do not have a choice in the matter. You are a tenant on a property that is in severe delinquency. A private equity firm called Vanguard Asset Management holds the paper on this land. My fund has already initiated the preliminary filings to absorb this property through a deed in lieu of foreclosure. It is a sealed deal. The adults are talking now, so why do you not go back inside and pack your bags?" He thrust the thick stack of papers toward me, his manicured finger tapping aggressively against the signature line. "This is a surrender of rights. It means you waive the mandatory eviction grace period. If you do not sign it, my firm will have the county sheriff drag you and the old man out by your collars tomorrow morning. Do you understand the big words I am using?" I did not look at the paper. I kept my eyes locked directly on his. The heat radiating off the muddy Georgia earth was suffocating, but my blood ran ice cold. "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the humid yard. "But it seems your expensive finance degree failed to teach you how to read a county zoning map. You want to execute a deed in lieu of foreclosure to a commercial holding company. Have you actually pulled the tax records for this parcel, Preston?" Preston scoffed, crossing his arms. "I do not need to pull tax records to know the land value covers the debt. That is all that matters in asset liquidation." "That is where you are catastrophically wrong," I said, taking a slow step forward. "This farm is registered under Georgia Code Section 48-5-7.4. It is an agricultural conservation use covenant. Grandfather Ezekiel secured it 15 years ago. Do you know what happens when a property under an active covenant is transferred to a non-qualifying commercial entity like your fraudulent little shell fund?" Preston's smirk finally vanished. His eyes darted to Reginald, but my father looked equally confused. Dominique groaned loudly from behind them, swatting at a mosquito completely oblivious to the financial landmine I was outlining. "I will educate you." I continued, closing the distance between us until I could smell the expensive cologne sweating off his neck. "If you force a transfer of this deed to a commercial fund for liquidation, it triggers an immediate non-negotiable breach of the conservation covenant. The penalty is not a slap on the wrist. It is a rollback tax applying to the last 10 years of property taxes doubled, plus compound interest payable immediately upon transfer." I watched the blood slowly drain from Preston's face. The arrogant flush in his cheeks was replaced by a sickly, chalky white. I did not raise my voice, but I drove every syllable into him like a nail. "But it gets worse for you, Preston," I whispered, leaning in closer. "Because you are using a commercial entity to execute the transfer, the state of Georgia will immediately reassess the property at its highest and best commercial value retroactively. The tax burden you will trigger the exact second this deed transfers to your name will instantly exceed $4 million. You do not have $4 million. You do not even have $4,000. And when your fund defaults on that state tax lien, it pierces the corporate veil. The state will audit your entire operation, and the federal investigators looking into your margin fraud will finally have the open door they need to subpoena every offshore account you possess." Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands began to tremble, the heavy legal document fluttering in his grip. He looked down at the mud, his mind clearly racing, trying to find a mathematical loophole in the trap I had just laid out. There was none. He was a cornered rat who had just realized the cheese was poisoned. "Vanguard." Preston stammered, his voice cracking, devoid of all its previous swagger. "Vanguard Asset Management agreed to the terms. They accepted the buyout proposal. I have the emails." "Vanguard Asset Management." I replied, my tone flat, An absolute strung you along to ensure you burned through the last of your liquid cash paying legal fees for a transfer that was never going to happen. Vanguard never accepted your proposal. Because I am the sole proprietor and primary shareholder of Vanguard Asset Management. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. The only sound was the distant hum of the distribution warehouse's massive cooling units. Preston staggered back a half step, his expensive leather shoes sliding in the muck. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disbelief. He looked from my greasy coveralls to my carbon fiber legs, struggling to reconcile the crippled veteran he had discarded with the corporate ghost that had systematically dismantled his entire life. The paperwork slipped from his trembling fingers, falling face down into the wet red clay. "You," Dominique shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. She pushed past Preston, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose. "You are Vanguard. You are the one who jacked up the lease on my clinic. You are the one holding my medical supplies hostage. You are ruining my life. You ruined your own life the moment you let your husband gamble with stolen money," I stated coldly, not sparing her a single ounce of pity. That was the breaking point. The realization that he had been completely outplayed, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by the daughter he deemed worthless shattered my father's carefully maintained facade of high society composure. Reginald Caldwell did not care about the law. He did not care about the tax codes. He only cared about power, and he was watching his slip away into the mud. He shoved Preston violently aside, stepping directly into my personal space. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The polished elder of the church was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered tyrant. "You think you can play these little corporate games with me, girl?" Reginald roared, his voice, a thunderous snarl that echoed off the metal walls of the warehouse. He raised a massive hand, his index finger pointing directly between my eyes. "I am your father. I built this family. I gave you life, and I will be the one to break you. You will sign over this company to me right now, or I swear to God you will not live to see tomorrow." I did not flinch at my father's roaring threat. I simply tilted my head, letting the silence stretch until his heavy, ragged breathing was the only sound left in the humid afternoon air. Ezekiel shifted his grip on the heavy iron wrench, the metal scraping audibly against his calloused palm, a quiet, deadly promise of violence if Reginald took so much as a half-step forward. But I did not need Ezekiel to protect me from this man. I looked at the father who had discarded me, observing the frantic pulse jumping in his thick neck. "Are you going to beat a federal tax fraud indictment out of me, Reginald?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but carrying a lethal, paralyzing weight. Physical threats are the last desperate resort of a man who knows he has absolutely no cards left to play. Before my father could launch another volley of empty rage, Dominique shoved him aside. She could not stand it. She could not stomach the reality that the sister she had spent a lifetime treating like a contagious disease was currently holding the deed to her entire existence. She marched up to me, the heels of her designer shoes sinking deep into the mud she so deeply despised. Up close, the panic hiding behind her oversized sunglasses was undeniable, but she masked it with a heavy, suffocating layer of entitlement and delusion. "You are completely out of your mind!" Dominique spat, her voice shrill, vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy. "You think playing dress-up as a corporate landlord changes anything? Look at you, Nia. Look at your pathetic, greasy coveralls. Look at your fake leg. You are a dropout, a crippled, miserable dropout who has spent her entire life seething with jealousy because I am everything you could never be." She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, her acrylic nails stopping just an inch from my collarbone. "I am Dr. Dominique Caldwell. I heal people. I am a pillar of the Atlanta medical community. My patients respect me. High society reveres me. You are nothing but a petty, vindictive girl sitting in a pile of cow manure trying to drag your betters down to your level." I let her vent. In tactical intelligence gathering, if you let an arrogant suspect speak long enough, they will inevitably hand you the exact weapon you need to destroy them. I stood perfectly still, breathing in the thick, earthy scent of the farm, letting her words wash over me without absorbing a single drop of their poison. Her insults were entirely meaningless, the frantic flailing of a woman who had never fought a real battle in her life. Dominique mistook my silence for submission. She took another step forward, emboldened, a triumphant, nasty sneer stretching across her perfectly glossed lips. You think you have us cornered because of a few supply chain hiccups and a lease dispute? You are playing checkers, Naya. We are playing chess. She crossed her arms, striking a pose of absolute superiority, despite standing ankle-deep in red clay and axle grease. Mom and Dad have already arranged a massive Juneteenth gala for me this weekend at the Ritz Hotel downtown. It is an exclusive invite-only charity event celebrating Black excellence and medical advancement in our community. Every major investor, every wealthy philanthropist, every political heavyweight in the state will be sitting at my tables writing massive checks to support my clinic. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a vicious, mocking hiss. We are going to raise millions. We will generate enough liquid capital in a single night to buy out your pathetic little Vanguard shell company, pay off Preston's minor administrative fines, and bulldoze this ragged, rotting farm right into the dirt. We are going to pave over Ezekiel's legacy and turn it into a parking lot. So enjoy your 5 minutes of feeling powerful in the mud, Nia. By Monday morning, you will be homeless, bankrupt, and exactly where you belong. Beneath my shoe. She finished her tirade breathless and panting, waiting for me to shatter. She expected tears. She expected me to scream, to lash out, to show the same lack of emotional control that dictated her entire life. But my military training had hardwired my brain for strategic combat, not emotional theatrics. She had just given me high-level, actionable intelligence on a silver platter. The Juneteenth Gala, the Ritz. A room full of wealthy donors ready to be defrauded by a family desperately trying to cover up millions in toxic debt and federal tax liabilities. It was not just a fundraiser. It was a massive, desperate scam draped in the sacred cloth of a cultural holiday. They were going to exploit the Black community's wealth, leveraging the concept of Black excellence, just to save Preston's white-collar fraud and their own crumbling empire. It was disgusting, but tactically it was a goldmine. They were gathering all their remaining credibility into one room, effectively painting a giant target on their own backs. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Dominique's flushed, triumphant face, then over at Preston's sweating, terrified pallor, and finally at my father's rigid, hateful glare. Slowly, I let a calm, genuine smile spread across my face. I gave Dominique a single approving nod, thanking her silently for handing me the exact coordinates of her final stand. Then for a fraction of a second, I shifted my gaze away from her. I looked directly into the lens of the security camera mounted on the corner of the warehouse, breaking the invisible barrier of the moment to acknowledge the trap that had just locked permanently into place. The silence following Reginald's explosive threat hung heavy and suffocating over the loading dock. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a manicured hand adorned with a massive glittering diamond ring settled gently onto my father's trembling shoulder. Vivian Caldwell stepped out from behind the imposing bulk of her husband. She had remained perfectly quiet by the vehicles until this exact moment, letting the men posture and roar before deploying her own specific brand of warfare. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored cream blouse and a flowing skirt that miraculously avoided the mud. Her face was arranged in a mask of profound maternal sorrow, her brow furrowed in a practiced expression of pained empathy. She was playing the role she loved most, the long-suffering matriarch trying to hold her fractured family together. "Reginald, please," she murmured, her voice soft and syrupy, deliberately designed to contrast with his booming rage. Shouting at her is not going to solve anything. You know how she gets when she feels cornered. She just shuts down. My father let out a sharp, disgusted exhale, jerking his shoulder away, but he took a half-step back, allowing my mother to take the floor. Vivian clasped her hands together in front of her waist, looking up at me with eyes swimming in manufactured tears. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the ramp. "Nia, darling, look at what you are doing. Look at the pain you are causing your father. Look at the stress you are putting on your sister. We are your family. We are your blood. I leaned back against the stack of medical crates, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched her with the clinical detachment of a sniper assessing wind speed. It was a fascinating psychological pivot. Bullying had failed, legal threats had backfired, so they were immediately transitioning to emotional extortion. You have always harbored so much anger, Vivian continued, her voice trembling with artificial vulnerability. We tried to understand it, especially after your deployment, after your tragic little accident. We hoped you would find peace out here in the country with your grandfather. But instead, you have just let that bitterness fester. You have let it turn you into someone cruel. Someone who would actively try to destroy her own flesh and blood just to feel powerful. I did not blink. I did not offer her a single inch of reaction. She took another step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial maternal whisper. You have to be reasonable, Nia. You have to look at the bigger picture. Dominique is a brilliant surgeon. She is saving lives. She is elevating the Caldwell name in ways you simply cannot. We all have our designated roles in this world. Your sister was born to shine, to lead, to carry our legacy forward. And sometimes those of us who are not meant for the spotlight have to make sacrifices to ensure the family survives. It is your duty to step aside. It is your place to support her, not to stand in her way out of petty jealousy. Sacrifice. I repeated, testing the word on my tongue like a bitter piece of fruit. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of the hysterical anger she was trying to provoke. That is a very elegant way of phrasing it, Mother. But I prefer to call it what it actually is. I uncrossed my arms and took a slow, deliberate step down the concrete ramp, forcing Vivian to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Let us talk about sacrifice, I said, keeping my tone conversational. Let us talk about the emerald green silk dress. Vivian's perfectly practiced expression of sorrow faltered. Her eyes darted left and right, clearly caught off guard by the abrupt shift in topic. A dress. What on earth are you talking about? We are discussing the foreclosure of a multi-million-dollar property, and you are bringing up a piece of clothing. I am bringing up precedent, I corrected her. I was 17 years old. I worked 4 nights a week washing dishes at a diner 2 towns over for 6 entire months to save up $350. I bought that emerald dress for the military academy winter ball. It was the first beautiful thing I had ever bought for myself with my own money. I hid it in the back of my closet because I knew how this family operated. Vivian's lips pursed into a thin, tight line. The maternal warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a defensive, brittle glare. I do not have time for ancient childish grievances, Nia. But I have plenty of time, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You found it while I was at school. You took it out of my closet, drove it to your personal tailor, and had it taken in 2 sizes so Dominique could wear it to the country club gala that same weekend because she had snagged a date with a state senator's son. When I came home and found my closet empty, you did not apologize. You looked me right in the eye and told me the dress was wasted on a girl built like a linebacker. You told me it was my sacrifice for the greater good of the family's social standing. Vivian scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. Dominique had an important social engagement. You were just going to some ridiculous high school dance. It was practical. You are holding on to a 20-year-old grudge over a piece of fabric while your family is facing absolute financial ruin. It is pathetic. It was never about the fabric, I stated, my eyes locking onto hers, forcing her to see the absolute certainty radiating from my face. It was the lesson. You taught me very early on that in the Caldwell household, my personal resources exist solely to fund Dominique's delusions of grandeur. You taught me that my property is just inventory waiting to be reassigned to the golden child. But you made one critical miscalculation today, Mother. I stepped fully into the mud, towering over her, letting the sheer physical presence of my anger push her back. I am no longer a 17-year-old girl living under your roof, I said, my words striking like hammer blows. And Vanguard Asset Management is not a silk dress you can just pull out of my closet. Vivian stumbled backward, her heel catching on a slick patch of clay. Reginald caught her by the arm, pulling her roughly behind him. His face was a dark, mottled purple. The realization that they had completely lost control of the narrative, that neither fear nor guilt could manipulate me anymore, was visibly tearing them apart. Preston was already retreating toward the lead SUV, his hands shaking as he frantically punched numbers into his cell phone. He was no longer trying to negotiate. He was trying to figure out how to stay out of federal prison. Dominique, however, could not accept defeat. She marched forward, pulling her scarf completely away from her face, her eyes blazing with a toxic, unhinged arrogance. "You think this makes you a winner?" Dominique shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet farm. "You think because you bought up some cheap debt, you can dictate terms to us? You are just a squatter holding a piece of paper in the mud. You have nothing. We are the Caldwells. We have connections you cannot even comprehend." She jabbed a finger in the direction of the city skyline miles away in the distance. "We will have the capital by Saturday night. The Juneteenth gala is completely sold out. The silent auction alone will bring in triple what we need to crush you and your little shell company. We are going to raise millions, Nia. We are going to bury you, and we are going to do it while the entire city applauds us." I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her. I simply smiled. It was a cold, bright, terrifying smile. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her threat, letting her believe she still held the upper hand. "I look forward to it, Dominique," I said softly. Reginald grabbed Dominique's arm, hauling her toward the vehicles. "We are leaving," he barked, throwing one last venomous look in my direction. "Enjoy the mud, Nia, because it is the only thing you will have left by Monday morning." They scrambled into their luxury SUVs, the doors slamming in rapid succession. The engines roared to life, the tires spinning wildly in the red clay, spraying thick mud across the pristine black paint as they executed a frantic, messy three-point turn. I stood perfectly still, watching them speed away down the long gravel driveway, their desperate retreat shrouded in a cloud of summer dust. Ezekiel stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He walked up beside me, lowering the heavy iron wrench to his side. He watched the dust settling at the end of the road, then turned to look at me, a quiet, fierce pride burning in his weathered eyes. "They are going to try and use that gala to wash the money," Ezekiel stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They are going to use our people's holiday to steal from their own community just to save their own skins." I reached down and picked up my muddy work gloves from the ground. I slapped them against my thigh, knocking the heavy clay loose. "I know," I replied, turning my gaze back toward the city. "Which is exactly why I am going to be the one giving the keynote address." I walked past Ezekiel, the heavy, rhythmic thud of my prosthetic echoing loudly on the wooden floorboards of the wraparound porch, and headed straight for the farmhouse kitchen. The screen door banged shut behind me, cutting off the humid summer heat. Ezekiel followed, his heavy work boots slow and deliberate. He watched in silence as I walked over to the deep porcelain sink, turned on the cold water, and began vigorously scrubbing the thick axle grease and red clay from my hands with a block of abrasive pumice soap. "Keynote address," Ezekiel said, rolling the words over in his mouth like a piece of tough chewing tobacco. "Dominique and your father have had that gala locked down for 6 months. They control the guest list, the security, the catering, and the microphone. How exactly does a grease-stained farmhand walk into the Ritz-Carlton and take the stage?" "Because Dominique is not the one paying for the ballroom," I replied, grabbing a rough towel and drying my hands. Preston was supposed to underwrite the entire event through his private equity fund. It was meant to be his grand philanthropic tax write-off to elevate Dominique's profile. But Preston is entirely broke. His accounts are frozen. The event organizers, the board of the Atlanta Medical Heritage Foundation, panicked 2 weeks ago when Preston's initial deposit bounced. "So who paid for it?" Ezekiel asked, though the slight knowing glint in his weathered eyes told me he already suspected the answer. "Vanguard Asset Management," I stated, tossing the damp towel onto the counter. "I wired the foundation $250,000 from Vanguard's corporate accounts to cover the venue, the catering, and the entertainment. I saved their gala from total cancellation. And as the anonymous primary benefactor, Vanguard was graciously offered the keynote slot to introduce the foundation's newest honoree, Dr. Dominique Caldwell." Ezekiel let out a low rumbling chuckle. It was a sound I rarely heard, rough and deeply satisfied. They are going to be standing on a stage you bought, eating food you paid for, waiting for a glowing introduction from a company they utterly despise. They think Vanguard is just a faceless corporate entity, I said, walking out of the kitchen and down the narrow hallway toward my bedroom. They think it is just a boardroom full of aggressive lawyers in Chicago. They have absolutely no idea that Vanguard is going to walk through the front doors of the Ritz in person. Ezekiel leaned against the doorframe of my room. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty window panes, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. And what exactly is your plan when you get up on that stage, Nia? You cannot just walk in there and throw punches. These are the most influential people in the state. They do not care about family drama. They care about money, reputation, and optics. If you go in there looking like a disgruntled, angry daughter, they will have security drag you out, and Reginald will spin it to the press to make you look clinically insane. I'm not going to throw punches, I said quietly. I am going to drop a bomb. I knelt beside my bed and reached underneath the frame, pulling out a heavy reinforced Pelican case. It was a military-grade tactical trunk, the exact kind usually reserved for transporting highly sensitive reconnaissance equipment or sniper rifles across hostile territory. It was battered, scuffed, and covered in faded shipping manifests from my deployments in the Middle East. The heavy metal latches snapped open with a sharp, synchronized crack. I flipped the lid back. There were no weapons inside, no tactical gear. Instead, resting perfectly flat beneath a layer of protective plastic wrapping was a bespoke, sharply tailored white tuxedo. The fabric was a flawless, brilliant ivory silk blend. The lapels were razor-sharp, the cut exacting and meticulous. It was a garment completely devoid of the mud, grease, and blood that had defined my life for the past 5 years. It was armor. Cold, clean, untouchable armor. Ezekiel stared down into the trunk. The reflection of the pristine white fabric seemed to catch the light in the dim room, creating a stark contrast against the rustic, dust-covered surroundings of the farmhouse. "That does not look like standard-issue infantry gear," he murmured. "It is for a different kind of war," I replied carefully, lifting the plastic to inspect the jacket. "Dominique called me a mud-stained squatter. She thinks because she wears designer labels and hosts charity dinners, she holds the high ground. She expects me to show up looking like a victim. She expects me to be angry, loud, and broken. I am going to walk into that ballroom looking sharper, wealthier, and more composed than every single person sitting at her VIP table. I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing a wounded soldier. They will only see an executioner." I let the plastic fall back into place and looked up at my grandfather. "I spent the last 6 months mapping every single illicit wire transfer Preston made. I have the bank routing numbers, the offshore shell company names, and the exact dates he funneled stolen money into Dominique's personal checking accounts to shield his assets from federal investigators. I have digital copies of the fraudulent loan applications Reginald signed, using his own church's collateral to illegally prop up Preston's failing fund." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "You are going to expose them to the entire room." "I am going to execute a flawless surgical strike," I corrected, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "I am going to stand at that podium in front of the mayor, the city council, and every major hospital director in Atlanta. I am going to project Preston and Reginald's wire transfers onto the massive screens directly behind the stage. I am going to show their entire community exactly where their charitable donations are really going, and I am going to do it with a smile on my face." I stood up, closing the heavy lid of the tactical case. The metallic click of the latches echoed with absolute finality in the quiet room. "Dominique and Reginald think they can wrap themselves in the flag of Juneteenth," I said, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel. "They want to use our people's holiday, a sacred day meant to celebrate liberation, truth, and resilience, as a convenient shield to hide their own corporate corruption. They want to use Juneteenth to raise capital to save a white fraudster." I met Ezekiel's eyes, holding his gaze with absolute, unshakable certainty. "I will show them what true emancipation looks like." The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Ritz-Carlton was a masterclass in curated opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles cast a warm golden glow over velvet-draped tables and towering floral centerpieces. The room was packed with the absolute apex of Atlanta high society. Politicians, hospital directors, wealthy philanthropists, and corporate titans were all mingling over vintage champagne and the soft, sophisticated melodies of a live jazz quartet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of money changing hands. It was a monument to wealth and privilege, and tonight it was entirely built on a foundation of desperate, pathetic lies. I stepped through the gilded double doors, leaving the quiet hallway behind. The bespoke ivory tuxedo fit like a second skin, a flawless silhouette of sharp angles and immaculate tailoring. I did not hide my carbon fiber leg beneath a wide pant leg. I wore it proudly, the woven black composite gleaming under the chandelier lights with every deliberate rhythmic step I took across the polished marble floor. The heavy metallic thud of my prosthetic cut through the low hum of polite conversation, a steady, relentless drumbeat signaling my arrival. Heads began to turn, conversations faltered and died. The sea of designer gowns and tailored suits naturally parted, clearing a wide path as I walked directly toward the center of the ballroom. I kept my posture rigid, my chin high, channeling every ounce of military discipline I possessed. I was not a rejected daughter crashing a party. I was an apex predator stepping into an enclosure. I let my eyes sweep across the room, watching the wealthy elite stare in a mixture of confusion and awe. It took exactly 30 seconds for my presence to register at the main VIP table, situated right below the grand stage. Dominique was standing near the podium, draped in a glittering gold gown, soaking in the admiration of a local television crew. Her smile froze, then collapsed completely, as she spotted the white tuxedo advancing through the crowd. Reginald was in the middle of shaking hands with a prominent state senator when his eyes locked onto me. The jovial, practiced smile slid off his face, replaced instantly by a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. Beside him, Vivian dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the floor, a sharp, dissonant crash that echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. They moved in unison, abandoning their wealthy targets to intercept me before I could reach the main floor. Vivian reached me first. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, terrified of the whispers already spreading among her socialite friends. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into the silk sleeve of my jacket. "What do you think you are doing?" Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with restrained hysteria, her eyes wide with a frantic animal terror. "You are a disgrace. You do not belong here. Get out before you ruin your sister's night." Reginald materialized right behind her, his massive frame blocking my path to the stage. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched tuxedo collar. "I warned you about playing games, Nia," he growled, stepping into my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "You think wearing a tailored suit changes who you are? You are trespassing at a private $1 million charity event. Turn around and walk out those doors right now, or I will have you arrested and thrown in a cell." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I calmly reached over and removed Vivian's trembling hand from my sleeve, dusting the silk off with a slow, deliberate brush of my fingers. "I am not going anywhere, Reginald," I replied, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly in the hushed airspace around us. "I have a speech to deliver." Reginald let out a sharp, incredulous scoff. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers sharply toward the entrance, a gesture of absolute entitled authority. "Security!" He barked, his voice echoing across the ballroom, causing several guests to gasp. "We have an intruder. Remove this woman from the premises immediately." 4 broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits moved swiftly across the room, cutting through the murmuring crowd. Leading them was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton, a man known throughout Atlanta for his impeccable discretion and absolute authority over the venue. Vivian crossed her arms, a triumphant, nasty sneer returning to her face. She leaned in close, her breath hot against my cheek. "You brought this on yourself, Nia. You pushed too far. You are about to be dragged out of here like common trash in front of the entire city. Watch what happens when you try to challenge your betters." Mr. Sterling stopped directly in front of us, the security team fanning out behind him. Reginald gestured aggressively toward me, his face twisted in a smug scowl. "Sterling, this woman is not on the guest list," Reginald demanded, projecting his voice so the nearby donors could hear his commanding tone. "She is harassing my family and causing a disturbance. Have your men escort her off the property right now and make sure she is banned from ever returning." The manager did not even look at my father. He did not acknowledge Reginald's command. He stepped past my father's outstretched arm, ignoring him completely. Mr. Sterling stopped 2 feet in front of me, placed his hands behind his back, and offered a deep, respectful bow. "Welcome, Miss Caldwell," Mr. Sterling said, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity, carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "Everything has been prepared exactly to your specifications. Please let me know if the host of tonight's gala requires anything else." The silence in the ballroom became absolute. The jazz quartet stopped playing. The low murmur of the crowd vanished entirely. Vivian staggered back as if she had been physically struck, her hand flying to her mouth as the color completely drained from her face. "I beg your pardon." Reginald stammered, the aggressive red flush draining from his face to leave a sickly ashen gray. "You work for me, Sterling. I arranged this gala." "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell," the manager replied, his tone remaining perfectly professional and utterly unyielding. "Your initial deposit was declined by your financial institution 2 weeks ago. The entire cost of tonight's event was graciously underwritten by Vanguard Asset Management, and we were explicitly instructed that their primary shareholder, Ms. Nia Caldwell, would be acting as our guest of honor. If you cause a disturbance, it is you who will be escorted off the property." Vivian looked like she had forgotten how to breathe. Reginald's mouth opened and closed silently, his grand authority shattered against the immovable wall of hard capital. I did not waste another second on their shock. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my ivory silk jacket and walked past them, the rhythmic thud of my carbon fiber legs sinking into the thick carpet as I entered the main ballroom. Across the vast glittering room, oblivious to the catastrophic power shift that had just occurred at the entrance, Preston was making his move. He had seen the schedule. He knew he was out of time. Desperation radiated from him in invisible waves, despite the sharp cut of his bespoke black tuxedo. He rushed up the side stairs to the grand stage, adjusting his tie and wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, tapping it twice. The sharp thumps echoed through the high-end sound system, immediately silencing the jazz quartet and pulling the attention of every billionaire politician and socialite in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, projecting his voice with a slick, practiced Wall Street charisma that he used to mask his absolute terror. "If I could have your attention, please. Welcome to this magnificent evening." I stopped in the center of the room, standing beside a towering centerpiece of white orchids. A waiter offered me a flute of sparkling water, which I accepted with a polite nod. I stood perfectly still in my stark white tuxedo, a solitary figure amidst a sea of dark suits and glittering gowns, and watched Preston work the crowd. "Tonight we are here to celebrate Juneteenth." Preston continued, his voice swelling with manufactured emotion. "We are here to celebrate freedom, resilience, and the undeniable power of Black excellence in Atlanta." We look around this room, and we see doctors like my beautiful fiancée, Dominique Caldwell, who are dedicating their lives to healing our community. We see generational wealth. We see unity. A gentle ripple of applause rolled through the ballroom. Preston smiled, leaning closer to the microphone, sensing he had them hooked. It was sickening. He was weaponizing the historical trauma and triumph of my people, using the language of liberation as a smokescreen to fleece the very community he pretended to uplift. He was counting on their shared pride to blind them to his deception. "But true excellence requires capital," Preston declared, pivoting smoothly into his pitch. "It requires investment. Dominique's clinic is just the beginning. My firm has partnered with leading developers to launch a massive urban revitalization fund. We are going to buy back our neighborhoods. We are going to build state-of-the-art medical centers, affordable housing, and community hubs." And we want the leaders in this room to be on the ground floor of this historic opportunity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small presentation remote. He pointed it at the AV booth in the back of the room and clicked the button. The massive LED screens spanning the entire back wall of the stage flared to life. They displayed incredibly glossy, high-resolution architectural renderings of pristine community centers and hospitals intercut with staggering financial graphs. The charts curved sharply upward, projecting massive guaranteed returns. "This is not just philanthropy," Preston said, his voice ringing with absolute predatory confidence. "This is smart business. We are projecting a 30% return on investment within the first 24 months. You are not just giving your money away, you are multiplying it while uplifting the city. We have the permits, we have the land. All we need is your partnership tonight to finalize the acquisitions." I scanned the room. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were nodding in approval. They were captivated by the renderings and blinded by the promise of high returns wrapped in a neat, socially conscious package. I watched men in expensive suits pull out their phones to take pictures of the slides. I watched philanthropists whispering excitedly to their spouses. They were completely unaware that they were looking at a desperate mirage. Preston did not have any permits. He did not own any land. Every dollar raised tonight was going straight into offshore accounts to pay off his massive fraudulent margin calls and save him from a federal indictment. He was standing on a stage I had paid for trying to rob my community blind. I reached into the inner pocket of my silk jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out my smartphone. I opened a secure encrypted messaging app. The AV technician sitting in the booth at the back of the room was not a Ritz-Carlton employee. He was a private security contractor I had hired through Vanguard Asset Management 3 days ago. I typed a single word into the chat window: execute. On stage, Preston raised his hands, preparing to deliver his grand finale. He swept his gaze across the ballroom, his smile wide and victorious. "We are building the future together. I ask you to open your portfolios tonight and join us." He clicked his remote to bring up the final slide containing the wire transfer details and routing numbers for his fraudulent fund. A harsh, screeching burst of digital static tore through the ballroom's pristine speakers, causing several guests to flinch and cover their ears. Preston turned around, his confident smile faltering as he slapped the side of his remote, clicking the button frantically. Suddenly, the massive screens behind him began to flicker violently. The glossy architectural renderings glitched, tearing into jagged lines of digital noise before Preston's entire presentation vanished completely into blackness. The chaos crescendoed, but before the venue security could even register the conflicting commands, Reginald Caldwell moved. He stormed past the VIP tables, his heavy footsteps thudding against the wooden stairs of the stage. He shoved Preston aside with a brutal shoulder check and ripped the microphone from Dominique's hands. He stood at the edge of the stage, a towering figure of patriarchal rage, his chest heaving heavily. He looked down at me, his eyes blazing with the kind of absolute furious authority he had used to terrorize our family for decades. "Silence!" Reginald bellowed into the microphone. His booming voice commanded a fraction of order in the chaotic room. He locked his furious gaze onto me, his face practically purple with rage. "You are a disgrace, Nia. You bring your petty, vindictive jealousy into a sacred event and humiliate your own blood. I am the head of this family. I am the master of this house, and I forbid you from speaking another word. You are nothing but a mud-stained embarrassment." I did not flinch. I walked forward, my prosthetic leg striking the marble floor with deliberate, measured precision. I ascended the stairs to the stage. Reginald stood his ground, trying to physically intimidate me, his massive frame blocking the podium. I stopped inches from him. I looked directly into his furious, bulging eyes. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and took the microphone from his sweating hand. He was so shocked by the absolute lack of fear in my eyes that his grip loosened and I pulled it free. I turned to the crowd. The noise in the ballroom slowly died down, replaced by a suffocating, expectant tension. The pace of the room ground to a halt. I tapped the screen of my phone once. The massive LED display behind us shifted again. Preston's fraudulent accounts vanished, replaced by a stark, heavily redacted legal document. The seal of the state of Georgia was clearly visible at the top. The bold black text outlined the transfer of a massive portfolio of debt, bearing the official signatures of the state's largest banking conglomerates. "You are right, Reginald," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that resonated through the silent ballroom with absolute finality. "You are the head of the house." I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "But I own you." I gestured toward the glowing screen behind me. "When I returned from my deployment, you stole $450,000 from my accounts to cover the fraudulent loans you took out against your own church. You thought the money simply disappeared. You thought you had buried the evidence." Reginald turned to look at the screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "That money did not disappear." I continued, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "It was heavily reinvested. I used it to buy up every single outstanding debt you and Preston possess. Vanguard Asset Management does not just underwrite the Scala. We own the mortgage on your precious Beacon Hill mansion. We own the collateral on your church. We own the deed to Dominique's clinic." I stepped closer to the microphone, staring down at my family, my eyes utterly devoid of mercy. "You wanted to stand on this stage and pretend to be royalty. You wanted to use my money to fund your illusion. But the truth is, you have absolutely nothing left. As of 5 o'clock this evening, Vanguard initiated immediate foreclosure on all defaulted assets." I looked directly at Vivian, who was standing paralyzed at the edge of the stage, her hands covering her mouth in silent horror. Then I looked back at Reginald and Dominique. "Tonight you are officially homeless." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy, pressing down on the stage like a physical weight. Reginald staggered backward. His massive hands blindly grasped the air, seeking the edge of the wooden podium for support that was no longer there. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, mottled ash. He looked at the massive screens projecting his financial ruin, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing in mute, suffocating horror. Vivian let out a low, strangled sob from the edge of the stage, her knees finally giving out. She crumpled to the floor, her expensive silk gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. She had spent her entire life stepping on others to maintain her grip on this opulent world, and in one swift motion I had shattered the ground beneath her. Dominique, however, refused to surrender the illusion. She lunged forward, her face twisted in an ugly mask of denial. "You are lying!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "You cannot do this. You do not have the power to do this. Preston has millions. His fund is backed by the biggest banks in the country. You are a jealous, pathetic squatter trying to scare us." I did not even look at her. I turned my head slightly toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. Right on schedule, a new sound bled into the heavy silence of the Ritz-Carlton. It started as a distant wail, then rapidly multiplied, transforming into a piercing, overlapping chorus of sirens. Red and blue lights began to flash violently against the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the crystal chandeliers in the frantic, strobing colors of a massive police response. The wealthy elite in the room immediately stepped back instinctively, creating a wide perimeter around the stage. They were predators themselves, and they knew exactly what blood in the water smelled like. The heavy double doors of the ballroom crashed open, violently shoved apart. Mr. Sterling, the general manager, stepped aside with practiced efficiency, allowing a specialized entry team to march directly onto the marble floor. These were not local Atlanta police officers responding to a disturbance. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters emblazoned across the back and chest. FBI. 8 federal agents moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They did not pause to admire the floral centerpieces or the vintage champagne. They cut a straight, uncompromising path through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, heading directly for the grand stage. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and eyes like chipped flint, kept his gaze locked entirely on one target: Preston Sterling Vance. Preston took one look at the tactical vests and the federal badges, and the last remnants of his Wall Street arrogance evaporated completely. He took a panicked step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the smooth stage floor. He bumped into the podium, knocking the microphone stand over with a loud, ringing crash. Preston Vance, the lead agent, barked, his voice projecting unquestionable authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Keep your hands where I can see them." He did not know it, but the agents holding the thick stack of warrants were operating precisely on the intelligence I had fed them. 2 weeks ago, I had compiled every shredded document, every offshore routing number, and every encrypted email detailing Preston's elaborate Ponzi scheme. I packaged it into a flawless, untraceable digital dossier and delivered it directly to the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I handed them the white-collar bust of the decade on a silver platter. I simply timed the detonation for tonight. 2 agents flanked Preston, immediately grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the ballroom. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. Preston did not fight back. The man who had stood on that stage just moments earlier preaching about generational wealth and community empowerment completely shattered. His legs gave out. The agents had to hold him up by his armpits as he collapsed toward the floor. "Please," Preston sobbed, his voice pitching into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly styled appearance. "It was a mistake. I can fix the numbers. I can get the money back. You have to listen to me. It was not just me." He twisted his head wildly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Reginald, who was paralyzed with shock just a few feet away. "Gun." He signed the papers. Preston shrieked desperately, throwing his father-in-law to the wolves to save his own skin. Reginald Caldwell signed the collateral loans. He gave me the church's assets to leverage. He knew exactly what we were doing. "Take him too." Reginald clutched his chest, gasping for air, looking like a man staring directly into the barrel of a loaded gun. Dominique stood frozen in absolute disbelief. Her golden ticket, the man who was supposed to elevate her to the highest echelons of Atlanta high society, was sobbing on the floor in federal handcuffs, begging for mercy like a coward. "No," Dominique stammered, shaking her head frantically. "No, this is a mistake. Preston, tell them to stop. Tell them who you are." She spun around, her eyes wide and manic, searching the crowd of elites who were now looking at her with a mixture of disgust and pity. She reached a trembling hand into her gold clutch. "I am calling our lawyers!" Dominique yelled, her voice bordering on hysteria. "I am calling the bank. We will post bail right now. We have unlimited resources. This is a harassment campaign orchestrated by my insane sister." She pulled out her phone and furiously dialed a number. The ballroom watched in complete silence as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, this is Dr. Dominique Caldwell," she demanded, projecting her voice to regain some semblance of control. "Connect me to the Private Wealth Management Division immediately." "Yes, regarding the Vance joint accounts." I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. I knew exactly what the voice on the other end of the line was about to tell her. Dominique's face contorted in confusion. "What do you mean flagged? What do you mean seized by the federal government?" She screamed into the receiver. "Check the secondary accounts. Check my personal black card. Check the platinum lines of credit." She listened for 5 agonizing seconds. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking utterly hollow. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the stage. Everything was gone. The FBI had frozen Preston's fraudulent assets, and Vanguard Asset Management had legally seized the rest of the Caldwell estate to cover the defaulted church loans. There was zero balance, no bail money, no emergency funds, no backup plan. Dominique's knees buckled, her grip failed. The exclusive custom-made Hermes Birkin bag she had carried into the gala like a crown jewel slipped from her hands. It hit the stage floor with a heavy final thud, spilling lipstick, credit cards, and useless keys across the wood. She fell to her knees beside the bag, staring blankly at the declined black credit card resting on the floorboards. The ultimate symbol of her superiority was now just a worthless piece of plastic. Her entire world built on arrogance and stolen money had been completely eradicated. I looked down at them. Reginald gasping for air, Vivian weeping on the floor, Preston sobbing in handcuffs, and Dominique staring into the abyss of her own ruin. I turned away from the stage, adjusting the cuffs of my ivory tuxedo, and began the long, quiet walk out of the ballroom. I had delivered my keynote address. As I descended the wooden stairs of the stage, the physical reality of their ruin rippled through the opulent ballroom. The affluent guests, the very same elite investors, surgeons, and politicians who had been sipping Reginald's vintage champagne and kissing Vivian's cheeks just an hour ago, physically recoiled. They stepped backward in unison, parting like the Red Sea. They created a wide, clear path for my exit, while simultaneously forming an impenetrable wall of turned backs against the Caldwell family. High society possesses a ruthless immune system, and it instantly isolates the infected. No one offered a hand to Dominique as she wept over her useless credit cards. No one met Reginald's panicked, searching gaze. Cell phones were raised recording their spectacular downfall, but not a single voice spoke up in their defense. They were instantly transformed into social pariahs, radioactive with federal indictments and total bankruptcy. I had taken perhaps 10 steps across the polished marble floor when the absolute finality of the situation finally broke Reginald. "Nia, wait." The voice was a ragged, pathetic croak. I paused, turning slowly on my heel. Reginald stumbled down the stage steps, his massive frame suddenly looking frail, old, and completely deflated inside his bespoke tuxedo. Vivian was right behind him, scrambling frantically, tripping over the heavy hem of her ruined silk gown. The terrifying patriarch and the ruthless matriarch of the Caldwell Empire had vanished. They collided with the marble floor right at my feet. Reginald's knees hit the ground with a heavy, defeated thud. He bowed his head, his chest heaving, entirely stripped of his terrifying authority. Vivian collapsed beside him, her hands reaching out, trembling violently. Her perfectly manicured fingers grasped desperately at the pristine white fabric of my trousers. "Nia, please." Vivian sobbed, her carefully applied expensive makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable, stripped of all its former aristocratic venom and condescension. "Daughter, I am begging you, please. You cannot do this to us. I am sorry. We are so sorry for everything. We are family. We are your blood." Reginald nodded frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We will make it right. We will give you whatever you want. Just call off the bank. Stop the foreclosures. You are a Caldwell." I looked down at them. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Hundreds of eyes watched the mighty, untouchable Caldwells, groveling in the dirt at the feet of the woman they had spent a lifetime trying to erase. I did not kick Vivian's hands away. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at them with an expression utterly devoid of pity, devoid of anger, devoid of anything resembling mercy. "On that Christmas Eve, when you threw me out into the freezing rain," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and carrying effortlessly through the dead quiet of the room. "When I begged you for a fraction of what you had to save my home, you looked me in the eye and taught me a very valuable lesson. You taught me that blood means absolutely nothing when compared to money." I stepped backward, allowing Vivian's grasping hands to slip away into empty air. "Now," I stated with absolute finality, "I have neither of those things for you." The morning sun broke over the sprawling manicured estates of the Caldwell's exclusive neighborhood, casting long, sharp shadows across their immaculate front lawn. It was a crisp, clear day, brutally indifferent to the empire that had completely collapsed just 12 hours prior. I stepped out of the back of my hired town car, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the suffocating, panicked heat of the gala. I leaned slightly on my cane, the rhythmic tap of the metal against the pavement signaling my arrival. 4 county sheriff's cruisers were already parked at aggressive angles across the expansive circular driveway, their lights silently flashing, reflecting off the towering white columns of the mansion. Uniformed deputies stood by the mahogany double doors, their hands resting casually on their utility belts, overseeing the systematic dismantling of a dynasty. A crew of heavy-set movers contracted directly by Vanguard Asset Management marched in and out of the grand foyer. They carried the physical manifestations of the Caldwells' stolen prestige. Custom velvet sofas, gilded antique mirrors, and armfuls of designer clothing in protective garment bags were hauled down the marble steps. The movers were not treating the items with the white-glove reverence Vivian Caldwell usually demanded. They were unceremoniously dumping everything directly onto the dew-soaked grass. A priceless crystal chandelier sat precariously next to a pile of Reginald's tailored silk suits. A box of expensive imported cosmetics spilled open, staining the pristine walkway. I stood on the sidewalk watching the chaos unfold, feeling a profound, chilling symmetry. 5 years ago, on a freezing Christmas Eve, those same mahogany doors had slammed shut in my face. My meager belongings, a duffel bag of military fatigues, and a box of medical records had been violently tossed into the freezing rain by Reginald himself, while Vivian watched from the warmth of the foyer, sipping tea and telling me I was a stain on their perfect image. Today the weather was beautiful, but the eviction was absolute. Vivian was sitting on a wrought iron patio chair that a mover had dragged onto the lawn. She was clutching a silver tea set to her chest, sobbing hysterically. Her hair, perfectly coiffed the night before, was a tangled wild mess. She reached out, trying to grab a designer handbag from a passing mover, but a deputy stepped between them, gently but firmly instructing her to remain seated. Reginald was pacing near the front columns, his face a bright, dangerous purple. He was arguing fruitlessly with the lead sheriff's deputy, his massive frame shaking with impotence. "Do you know who I am?" Reginald bellowed, pointing a thick finger at the officer. "I am a pillar of this community. You cannot throw my property onto the street like garbage. I will have your badge. I will call the governor." The deputy did not even blink. He simply handed Reginald a clipboard bearing the final irrevocable foreclosure notice and pointed a thumb toward the street. "You do not own this property anymore, Mr. Caldwell," the deputy stated with bored finality. "You have exactly 20 minutes to vacate the premises before you are arrested for trespassing." Then the front doors opened one last time. Dominique stepped out. The illusion of the untouchable superior surgeon had been completely stripped away, leaving a fractured, terrified woman in its wake. She wore a simple gray sweatsuit, her face pale and heavily lined with exhaustion. She carried a single cardboard box containing what little personal items the federal agents had not seized as evidence during their midnight raid. She looked at the sprawling pile of her belongings on the grass, the ruined empire, and then her eyes found me, standing at the edge of the driveway. She did not yell. She did not hurl the usual insults or roll her eyes. She walked slowly toward me, her steps heavy, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes darting nervously to the armed deputies, then back to my face. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been replaced by a hollow, gnawing terror. "Preston is being held in federal custody without bail," she said, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper that sounded entirely foreign to her. "They froze the clinic's operating accounts. The state medical board called me at 6 this morning. They are suspending my license pending the federal investigation. They are looking into the fraudulent billing Preston ran through my practice." I said nothing. I just watched her, my expression a blank, unreadable mask, offering zero comfort and zero absolution. "Nia, please." Dominique continued, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, cutting tracks down her pale cheeks. She dropped her cardboard box onto the driveway and took a step closer, her hands clasped together in front of her chest, in a gesture of pure submission. "I have nothing left. They took my cars, my savings, my retirement accounts. I have a child to feed. You took everything from us. You won. I am begging you. I am a highly educated doctor. I am a hard worker. Give me a job at Vanguard. Give me a consulting role, a research position, an administrative desk, anything. I will work for a fraction of my previous salary. I just need to survive. We are sisters." The desperation in her voice was thick, but the underlying entitlement was still there. Even in ruins, she believed she deserved a high-level white-collar position. I looked at the woman who had laughed when I struggled to afford my physical therapy, who had used my trauma as a punchline at her dinner parties, who had called security to have me arrested just hours ago. I reached into the leather tote bag slung over my shoulder. I did not pull out a consulting contract or a checkbook. I pulled out a folded package of stiff, dark blue fabric wrapped in clear plastic. I tossed it directly at her chest. Dominique fumbled catching the package before it hit the pavement. She looked down at it, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Through the clear plastic, the bold white letters printed across the chest pocket were clearly visible: Vanguard Facilities Management. It was a standard-issue janitorial uniform. The logistics warehouse in the basement of Vanguard's downtown building has a severe staffing shortage. I said, my voice as cold and hard as the concrete beneath our feet. They need someone to scrub the employee toilets and mop the loading docks. Dominique stared at the blue uniform, her face contorting in pure shock and rising revulsion. Her hands began to shake violently. "You want me, a board-certified surgeon, to clean toilets?" She choked out, her voice trembling with indignation and horror. "You are not a surgeon anymore, Dominique," I reminded her, turning my back on her and walking toward the open door of my waiting car. "You are a federal suspect with 0 assets and a suspended license. The job pays minimum wage. There are no benefits and the shifts start at 4 in the morning. Take it or leave it." I slid into the back seat of the town car, not bothering to look out the window as the driver pulled away from the curb. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly sealing away the flashing police lights, the frantic shouting, and the pathetic remnants of a fallen dynasty. That chapter of my life was permanently closed. 6 months later, the atmosphere in the grand living room was entirely transformed. The stifling, oppressive scent of Vivian's heavy floral perfumes and Reginald's imported cigars had been completely eradicated. In its place was the crisp, clean energy of productivity, the smell of fresh coffee, and the quiet hum of high-end servers. The space, the exact same room where Reginald had once towered over me as a tyrant and violently banished me into the freezing rain, was unrecognizable. The gaudy aristocratic oil paintings and velvet curtains had been stripped down to the studs. The walls were now a brilliant, sharp white, lined with glowing digital tracking boards and real-time supply chain maps. It was no longer a monument to stolen vanity and fake high society prestige. It was the sleek, modern executive command hub of Vanguard Medical Logistics. Grandfather Ezekiel sat at a vast, polished glass conference table near the center of the room. He was meticulously reviewing a stack of legitimate, audited shipping manifests, a genuine, profound smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. His health had improved dramatically over the past few months. His spirit, once crushed under the weight of his son's toxic manipulation, was entirely restored by honest work and absolute peace. He looked up from his paperwork, catching my eye across the room, and gave a slow, deeply proud nod. I returned the gesture, feeling a profound sense of closure. I turned back to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, resting my weight comfortably and naturally on my prosthetic leg. I held a steaming cup of chamomile tea, feeling the soothing warmth seep into my palms. I looked down at the sprawling courtyard below, which had been efficiently paved and converted into a commercial loading zone. The space was buzzing with disciplined, synchronized activity. A massive fleet of pristine, heavy-duty logistics trucks was lining up for the morning dispatch. Painted flawlessly on the side of each gleaming white trailer was our newly minted corporate crest, Ezekiel and Naya Medical Supply. They were fully loaded with state-of-the-art equipment and essential medicines, heading out to properly supply the inner-city clinics and minority-owned practices that Preston and Dominique had so ruthlessly tried to bleed dry. As the first truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the crisp morning mist as it pulled out onto the main road, the perspective slowly pulls back, widening the frame to capture the sheer scale of the operation. "They took my dignity," my voice echoed in a steady, resolute voiceover. "They mocked my military service. They stripped me of my financial security and threw me out into the freezing, unforgiving night, expecting me to quietly freeze to death in their shadow. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that when you bury a soldier in the dark, suffocating mud, you are not burying a corpse. You are planting a seed. And what grows from that dark earth is an unstoppable, unforgiving empire. Never underestimate the child you cast aside. Never look down on the blood you abandoned, because it is highly likely that the very same outcast will be the one holding the pen, writing the final inescapable will and testament of your life. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, watching my empire roll out into the dawn, fade to black.